Hi guys, I just wanted to give you some extra advice about how to write your personal project report. So I'm just going to go through it step by step to help you in the different phases. This is the first section on section A, looking at the investigation. Firstly, when you start to write your report, you need to think about the format. You need to make sure that the format is consistent so it looks good and adheres to what a report should do, which is the same font, the same size of font, titles. The layout and the organisation is really part of how you communicate this. You need to make sure you've got a good front cover with your name, an image of the product or the exhibition, your candidate number, your word count, and any other information about that. Let me show you an example now. This is my front cover, so it's got my title here, it's got a goal, I'll put my name, I'll have my candidate number, which was given to you in YA. It's up against the board as well. And when I finish my report, I can put my word count, right? But that personalizes it as a nice front cover to your report. Let's pop back to formatting now. The next thing you need in the on the second page is a contents page, and this is to communicate clearly the different sections of your report. Now, our sections are the four main areas, which is the investigation phase, planning, action, and reflection. Within each of these, we're then going to have the subheading questions, which I'll talk about in a minute. You need to follow this format so then it's easy for your supervisor to grade, but also when it's externally moderated, it needs to be clear to someone who has not followed the process closely with you how and what you've done in this process. You need to make sure that any evidence or examples that you include in your report, whether it be in the appendix or in the body of the report, are clearly labelled and titled. That means that you number all the figures from the beginning to the end in numerical order. So the first figure that you use will be figure 1, and it might be that you say see figure 1 in appendix, and then in the appendix you would clearly title the screenshot or the piece of evidence as figure 1, a mind map showing thinking, or whatever else. If it's within the body of the report, the same is applied. It needs a clear title, and you need to say refer to figure 1 below and what it is. All right. In the appendix, then, all the sample evidence needs to accumulate to only 10 additional pages to your report. Please be mindful of those 10, because if there's any more, they will not be graded and they will not be accepted by the IB, and that will be a real shame. And lastly, you must include a full bibliography. So you must have your bibliography correctly formatted in alphabetical order following the MLA referencing. Communication then. Communication is key within the report as it is within your project. You need to make sure that this report is written clearly, coherently, and using concise language. That means that if you are doing a project which requires you to define any subject-specific vocabulary or acronyms, technical language, you need to make sure that that's clearly communicated for someone that may not understand it as clearly as you. You need to make sure that all the sections are written in full sentences and that you really stick to this word count because you have to declare it on the front. That means that you can include tables and text boxes and annotations because they are free words. So you can use screenshots and text boxes to annotate how and why you did what you did, and that will not eat into that word count. So be mindful of tricks of the trade on how you can use concise, specific language, but also get to the heart of what you're meant to be discussing. We're now going to move on to section A and look at what is required for each of the different aspects for that. So here's my contents page. I've clearly got my 4 different headings of my sections and my appendix bibliography. I will then attribute the different page numbers to these sections once I've written them, so that it's nicely communicated where to find the different information. So section 1, the investigation. Here is my first subheading then. I need to include my subheading because it directly links to the criterion strand. How did you define a clear goal and global context for the project based on personal interest? So there's 2 aspects to this criterion strand. You need to make sure that you not only clearly state what your goal is, you may want to put your goal in a text box so that it really stands out, and within that you may want to define any key terms or vocabulary within the goal. You need to make sure that you have a thoughtful and in-depth description of how your goal meets a personal and or a community relevance. Now, by showing that your project and your goal is extending further than just your own personal achievement, that's how you're demonstrating how it's highly challenging. You may also need to justify concisely how your project is challenging in nature if it's not so clear. So make sure you can justify firstly why you chose the goal and your personal interests in the journey of taking this process on, and how it's highly challenging. The second part to this strand is that you must say which global context you're using. You must define what the global context is and why you've decided that it's going to be helpful to look through this lens in doing your goal. To get further information on global context, if you go onto its manage back, you will find under files there is a document under criteria A under global context about the different global contexts, and these help you to refine and understand and go back to this global context understanding and think about what was it that your inquiry was focused on. Why did you choose personal cultural expression? What did you want to look at within that, and how have you explored that, or how do you intend to explore that? Okay, going back then, please make sure as well that you only have one global context for your project. Criterion strand 2 for section A. What prior learning and subject-specific knowledge was relevant to the project, or do you have? What subject-specific knowledge really requires you to set a baseline, as in like, what do you currently know, or what did you know at the beginning of the process? You may want to refer to specific detailed examples. I knew X, but I needed to find out more about Y, for example. You need to try and think about whether there was any MYP subjects, such as design, the design cycle, art, English, that links to what you're doing with your goal. So you're trying to draw together and transfer the knowledge from multiple subjects. Again, the key here is to be specific and choose examples of how and what knowledge you had before. You may want to use the document on its learning, which was I know, I want to know, and the inquiry questions you're looking into, as additional evidence, because it clearly shows how you're thinking through the aspects of this criterion strand. Lastly then, criteria, the third one is how have you demonstrated researching skills? Now, it's important that you think about the different researching skills that you demonstrated in your project. Most of the skills that you focused on was the variety of sources that you found. So you need to be thinking about how have you demonstrated the different types of resources and show this through referencing to your bibliography. That will be after your appendix, but you need to say I've demonstrated a variety and why and how that has helped you within your research. Secondly, you need to make sure that in your bibliography, as I mentioned before, that it is all correctly referenced and it's accurate, because that's part of demonstrating good researching. Understanding property rights, understanding that when you're using other people's information, that it needs to be either correctly paraphrased or correctly quoted, using in-text citations if necessary. So if you've done that in parts of your process journal, print screen that evidence and show how, even if it's just small clippets, how you've done that within demonstration of this research skill. And the third piece of evidence was the evaluation of sources. Now, many of you followed my advice and filled in the research table as you went along, doing origin, purpose and value, or positives and negatives about the source. By being critical, and as the language used here, thinking about the credibility and the accuracy of the sources, you need to discuss how and why using that skill was valuable for you in demonstrating researching skills. You need to think about you doing the process of looking at the limitations and the strengths. What did that do and how did that further your understanding and your knowledge? Again, specific information, specific evidence, not just a waffle about research and why it's important. You may want to think about one particular source that's been most helpful and why it was so instrumental in moving your knowledge forward or moving your understanding of the project forward, for example. And remember, people are resources too, and that can be really helpful. That concludes section A of how to write the personal project report.